Montreal is more than a city, it's a living palimpsest, each street carrying whispers of another era. Beneath the hum of cafes and festivals lies a story layered with resilience, conquest, rebellion and reinvention. From the Iroquoian village of Hochelaga to the soaring towers of today, Montreal has stood at the crossroads of empires, languages and dreams. This is not just a history lesson, it is a cinematic journey, tracing the heartbeat of a metropolis forever caught between worlds. Let us step back in time into Montreal's untold past and watch the city rise, fall and rise again. Long before anyone spoke of Montreal, there was Hochelaga. Nestled near the foot of Mount Royal, this fortified Iroquoian village thrived along the St. Lawrence River, its wooden palisades encircling longhouses and fields of maize. The St. Lawrence was more than a river. It was a lifeline, a highway and a source of sustenance. Fishing weirs fashioned from sharpened wooden stakes lined its currents. The people here were not passive inhabitants. They were engineers, planners and custodians of a thriving community. When Jacques Cartier arrived in 1535, he was struck by the scale and sophistication of Hochelaga. His journals describe hundreds of people greeting him, offering gifts, and pointing toward the sacred mountain that would later lend its name to the city. But Hochelaga's story is one of both presence and disappearance. By the early 1600s, when Samuel de Champlain mapped the region, the village was gone, likely dispersed by disease, conflict or migration. This chapter sets the tone for Montreal's layered identity, indigenous ingenuity forming the foundation of a place later transformed by colonial powers. The echoes of Hochelaga remain beneath the city's streets, in archaeological finds and oral traditions, reminding us that Montreal did not begin with the French, but with the first peoples whose deep connection to the land still resonates. It is a story of resilience and roots, of a city born from the wisdom of those who understood the St. Lawrence not just as water, but as life itself. In 1642, French settlers founded Ville-Marie on the island of Montreal, guided by dreams of religious devotion and colonial expansion. Paul de Chaumet de Maisonneuve, alongside Jeanne Mance, envisioned a missionary colony dedicated to the Virgin Mary. The settlement was modest at first, a few wooden structures surrounded by palisades, vulnerable to both weather and conflict. Yet the dream was ambitious, to create a new Jerusalem in the wilderness. The settlers faced immense challenges. Harsh winters, flooding and constant tension with the Haudenosaunee tested their resolve. Food was scarce, disease rampant and survival uncertain. Yet through faith and sheer determination, Ville-Marie endured. Jeanne Mance, often called the co-founder of Montreal, established Hôtel Dieu Hospital, bringing medical care to settlers and indigenous alike. Her compassion laid the groundwork for the city's tradition of social institutions. The fur trade quickly became the settlement's lifeblood. Positioned at the confluence of waterways, Ville-Marie was perfectly located for commerce. Beaver pelts flowed from the interior, destined for European markets, while trade alliances brought both wealth and conflict. The settlement's survival was tied not just to faith, but to commerce and diplomacy. This chapter highlights how Ville-Marie was never merely a religious outpost. It was a place where faith, trade and survival intertwined. From its earliest days, Montreal bore the marks of resilience, ambition and cultural collision, a city born of idealism but shaped by the realities of the land and its people. Ville-Marie's foundation was fragile, but its vision was unshakable. By the late 17th century, Montreal had become a vital hub in the fur trade, a node connecting indigenous trappers, French merchants and European markets. Canoes laden with pelts arrived from the Great Lakes, transforming Ville-Marie into a bustling center of exchange. Yet trade was not merely economic, it was cultural, diplomatic, and often fraught with tension. Alliances with indigenous nations were both fragile and essential. The French relied on Wendat and Algonquin partners for furs, knowledge of the land, and military support. In return, indigenous communities gained access to metal tools, firearms, and textiles. But trade also carried devastating consequences. Alcohol destabilized some communities, while disease continued to ravage populations. The fur trade was a double-edged sword, enriching some while eroding traditional ways of life. Meanwhile, religion shaped Montreal's social fabric. The Sulpicians, who took over the seigneury of the island, guided its development with a firm hand. Churches and missions spread, reinforcing Ville-Marie's Catholic character. Yet alongside faith was conflict. The city's palisades bore witness to repeated attacks, and its residents lived in constant vigilance. This chapter captures the paradox of Montreal's growth. Faith and commerce intertwined, cooperation and conflict hand in hand. The fur trade brought wealth but also dependency. The missionaries brought charity but also control. Montreal's character as a crossroads of cultures was already evident, an uneasy balance of survival, spirituality and ambition. The mid-18th century brought seismic change. New France was caught in the global conflict of the 7 Years' War, as Britain and France clashed for dominance in North America. Montreal, once a thriving French stronghold, became a pawn in an empire-wide struggle. The pivotal moment came in 1759 on the Plains of Abraham outside Quebec City. Though the battle was fought far from Montreal, its outcome sealed the city's fate. The French lost their grip on Canada. By 1760, Montreal surrendered to British forces, marking the end of New France. For the city's residents, this transition was profound. French-speaking Canadians suddenly found themselves subjects of the British Crown, their institutions reshaped by new rulers. Yet, unlike other conquests, the British allowed the French language, religion and legal traditions to persist. The Quebec Act of 1774 enshrined Catholic rights, creating a foundation for the city's dual identity. The conquest did not erase Montreal's French character, it transformed it. British merchants soon dominated trade, turning the city into a commercial powerhouse. Scottish and English entrepreneurs brought capital and connections, while French Canadians remained the cultural and demographic core. This chapter reflects on Montreal's resilience in the face of conquest. Rather than diminish, the city adapted, forging a new identity as a bilingual, bicultural metropolis. The conquest set the stage for Montreal's future, a city forever negotiating its place between two empires, two languages, and two ways of life. The early 19th century was an era of tension. Montreal, like much of Lower Canada, simmered with discontent. French-speaking Canadians, often sidelined in political and economic life, demanded reforms. British elites controlled much of the city's commerce, fueling resentment among a population eager for representation. This discontent erupted in the rebellions of 1837, 1838. Led by the Patriots, these uprisings sought greater autonomy, responsible government and protections for French culture. Though centered more in rural areas, Montreal was both a staging ground and a witness to the turmoil. The rebellion was brutally suppressed, its leaders executed or exiled. Yet its spirit lived on, shaping the city's political trajectory. The aftermath brought reform. The Act of Union in 1840 merged Upper and Lower Canada into the Province of Canada, with Montreal briefly serving as the capital. Though the union was intended to assimilate French Canadians, it instead fueled their determination to preserve language and culture. Political alliances between reformers eventually led to responsible government, a crucial step toward Canadian democracy. This chapter frames rebellion not as failure, but as catalyst. Montreal's streets bore witness to both repression and reform, its people caught between colonial power and local resistance. The struggle for identity, voice and autonomy became central to the city's DNA. Montreal was no longer just a commercial hub. It was a crucible of political ideals, forging a path toward the Canada to come. By the mid-19th century, Montreal was Canada's economic engine. The expansion of its port transformed the city into a hub of global trade. Ships carrying goods from Europe, the Caribbean and beyond docked along the St. Lawrence, while canals and railways linked the city to the continent's interior. Montreal's strategic location, midway between the Atlantic and the Great Lakes, made it indispensable. Industrialization reshaped the city's landscape. Factories rose along the waterfront, powered by immigrant labor. Textiles, machinery and food processing fueled growth, drawing thousands from rural Quebec and abroad. Irish immigrants fleeing famine, Scots seeking opportunity, and later Jewish, Italian and Eastern European families all contributed to Montreal's mosaic. Yet progress came with cost. Working-class neighborhoods were crowded and unsanitary, while wealth concentrated in the Golden Square Mile, where Anglo-Scottish elites built grand mansions. The city's divisions, linguistic, social and economic, became stark. This chapter highlights Montreal's transformation into a modern metropolis. The port and railways cemented its role as Canada's commercial capital, while waves of immigrants diversified its population. The tension between prosperity and inequality, tradition and change, laid the groundwork for the city's next great transformations. Montreal was no longer just a colonial outpost. It was an industrial giant, its fortunes tied to the engines of progress. As Montreal expanded, its character reflected the Victorian age. The city's streets echoed with horse-drawn carriages, gas lamps flickered at night, and brick row houses rose in dense neighborhoods. Institutions flourished, universities, hospitals, and cultural societies, many founded by English-speaking elites but serving a growing, diverse population. Religion remained central. Catholic parishes structured French-Canadian life, anchoring communities in faith and tradition. Meanwhile, Protestant institutions reinforced the influence of the Anglophone minority, creating a parallel social world. Montreal was a city of dualities, two languages, two faiths, two sets of institutions, often operating side by side. Charity and reform movements emerged in response to industrial poverty. Orphanages, schools and hospitals expanded, many led by women's religious orders. The city's fabric was woven not just by politicians and merchants, but by teachers, nurses and community leaders whose work sustained its people. Yet the Victorian era also revealed deep divides. Working-class families crowded into unhealthy conditions, while elites strolled Mount Royal Park, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, the visionary behind New York's Central Park. Montreal's dual identity was not just cultural, it was economic, visible in every neighborhood. This chapter captures the texture of 19th century life, a city at once grand and gritty, where Gothic revival churches stood beside crowded tenements. Montreal's Victorian streets tell a story of ambition and inequality, faith and philanthropy, a city growing into its role as Canada's beating heart. The turn of the 20th century brought new waves of immigrants, reshaping Montreal's character once again. Italians, Greeks, Jews, Chinese and Ukrainians arrived in search of work and refuge, settling in neighborhoods like Mile End and Little Italy. Each group brought language, faith and traditions, weaving new threads into the city's cultural fabric. Immigration fueled growth but also sparked tension. French Canadians worried about assimilation and economic competition, while Anglophones often controlled industry and commerce. For newcomers, life was not easy. Factories demanded long hours for little pay and discrimination was common. Yet communities persevered, building cultural associations, churches, synagogues and businesses that enriched the city's diversity. Montreal became a city of layers, French and English at its core, but increasingly multicultural at its edges. Markets rang with the sound of many languages, and cuisines blended into a distinct urban flavor. Immigrant labor built the city's infrastructure, while immigrant culture infused its streets with new rhythms. This chapter underscores how Montreal's strength lay in its diversity. Each wave of arrivals faced hardship, but each left a mark, from the bagel shops of Mile End to the cafes of Little Italy. Montreal's identity was never fixed. It evolved with every arrival, every adaptation, every compromise. It became a city where belonging was contested, but where culture thrived in the tension between old and new. By the early 20th century, Montreal was Canada's largest city and its financial powerhouse. Banks, insurance companies and railways headquartered here made it the beating heart of commerce. Skyscrapers began to pierce the skyline, symbolizing ambition and modernity. Yet beneath the glamour lay sharp contrasts. The Golden Square Mile was home to some of the wealthiest families in the nation, whose fortunes shaped philanthropy and industry. Meanwhile, working-class districts like Griffintown housed Irish labourers in cramped conditions, plagued by poverty and disease. The French majority often felt excluded from economic power, while English elites dominated business and politics. Cultural life, however, thrived. Theatres, newspapers and universities buzzed with activity. Montreal was Canada's cultural capital, producing writers, artists and thinkers who shaped national identity. The city's duality, French and English, rich and poor, tradition and modernity, was both its challenge and its vitality. This chapter reflects on Montreal's paradox, a city of immense wealth and deep inequality, a place of both opportunity and exclusion. The contrasts were visible in language, class and neighborhood, creating a city forever negotiating its identity. Montreal's complexity was not a weakness but a defining feature, setting the stage for the upheavals to come. The World Wars tested Montreal's unity and resilience. During World War I, thousands enlisted, factories turned to munitions, and the port shipped supplies across the Atlantic. Yet conscription sparked fierce opposition among French Canadians, who felt alienated from imperial wars. The divide between English and French communities widened, leaving scars that lingered for decades. World War II brought similar challenges. Montreal's factories once again fueled the war effort, producing planes, ships, and armaments. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, reshaping social roles. Yet conscription once more ignited protest, exposing linguistic and cultural rifts. The city's unity was fragile, strained by competing loyalties. Despite tension, Montreal endured. The post-war era brought economic prosperity, urban expansion, and new waves of immigration. Returning soldiers built families, suburbs spread, and the city's skyline climbed higher. Montreal emerged stronger, but also more divided. Its resilience tested by war and its identity sharpened by conflict. This chapter portrays Montreal not just as a participant in global wars, but as a microcosm of Canada's struggles: unity and division, sacrifice and dissent, resilience and renewal. The city's story during wartime is one of both hardship and transformation, laying the groundwork for the social revolutions to come. In 1967, Montreal hosted Expo 67, the world's fair that transformed the city into a global showcase. For 6 dazzling months, the world came to Montreal, and Montreal shone in return. Pavilions from across the globe lined the St. Lawrence. Architectural marvels like Buckminster Fuller's geodesic dome captured imaginations, and the metro whisked visitors beneath the city with sleek efficiency. Expo was more than spectacle, it was a statement. Montreal declared itself modern, cosmopolitan, and confident. The event coincided with Canada's centennial, amplifying its significance. For many, Expo 67 represented the peak of Montreal's influence, a moment when the city stood proudly on the world stage. Yet Expo also reflected tensions beneath the surface. The Quiet Revolution was reshaping Quebec society, loosening the grip of the Catholic Church and fueling demands for linguistic and cultural recognition. While Expo celebrated internationalism, Quebec nationalism simmered at home. This chapter captures the magic and meaning of Expo 67. It was Montreal's coming-of-age party, a festival of architecture, art, and optimism. But it was also a pivot point, a moment of pride shadowed by growing tension. The city could dazzle the world, but it still had to confront its own internal struggles. Expo 67 remains etched in memory as Montreal's brightest hour, a celebration of possibility and identity. The 1960s brought seismic change in Quebec, and Montreal was its epicenter. The Quiet Revolution dismantled old structures, challenging the dominance of the Catholic Church, modernizing the economy and asserting French-Canadian identity. It was a time of rapid social and cultural transformation, redefining the city and the province. Education, once tightly controlled by religious orders, became a tool for modernization. Hydro-Quebec, symbol of national pride, embodied the push for economic self-determination. French language and culture gained prominence, asserting themselves in a city long dominated by English business elites. Montreal's billboards, once overwhelmingly English, began to reflect a new linguistic reality. But with pride came conflict. The rise of Quebec nationalism fueled political movements, from peaceful advocacy to radical separatism. The FLQ crisis in 1970 revealed the depth of frustration as bombs and kidnappings shook Montreal. The October crisis brought soldiers into the streets, a stark reminder of the tensions underlying the city's transformation. This chapter presents Montreal as both stage and actor in the Quiet Revolution. The city was not just changing, it was leading change. The Quiet Revolution gave Montreal a new voice, proud and assertive, demanding recognition. The city's dual identity, long a source of tension, became the foundation for a renewed cultural vitality. Montreal was no longer just bilingual, it was defiantly francophone, proudly Quebecois, and ready to chart its own path. In 1976, Montreal hosted the Summer Olympics, a monumental event that promised glory but left mixed legacies. The Olympic Stadium, with its futuristic tower, symbolized ambition but also became notorious for cost overruns and structural issues. The Games themselves showcased athletic triumphs. Nadia Comaneci's perfect 10S, Bruce Jenner's decathlon victory. But for Montreal, the aftermath was complicated. The Olympics placed Montreal on the global stage, but the financial burden was staggering. Debts from construction lingered for decades, earning the stadium the nickname the Big O. Yet, despite criticism, the Games left cultural and urban imprints. The stadium became an icon, the metro expanded, and Montreal's international profile rose. The 1970s also brought demographic shifts. Anglophones and businesses increasingly left for Toronto, frustrated by Quebec's political climate and language laws. Montreal, once Canada's financial capital, began ceding economic dominance. The city's pride was wounded, its future uncertain. This chapter explores Montreal's Olympic story as both triumph and cautionary tale. The Games embodied ambition and showcased Montreal's cultural richness, but they also highlighted the city's challenges, financial, political, and social. The Olympics remain a symbol of Montreal's boldness, its willingness to dream big, even at great cost. A city of resilience, Montreal carried on, scarred but unbowed, ready for the struggles ahead. The late 20th century saw language and identity at the forefront of Montreal's story. Bill 101, passed in 1977, enshrined French as the official language of Quebec, reshaping the city's cultural landscape. English signs gave way to French, schools shifted policies, and the city's linguistic identity transformed overnight. For many Francophones, Bill 101 was liberation, a reclaiming of culture and dignity after centuries of marginalization. For Anglophones and immigrants, it was more complex. Some adapted, embracing French as part of daily life. Others left, fueling an exodus of businesses and families to Toronto and beyond. The city's demographics shifted, its identity sharpened by law and politics. Meanwhile, referendums on Quebec's sovereignty in 1980 and 1995 polarized the city. Streets buzzed with debates, rallies, and hope. Montreal, with its diverse population, often leaned toward federalism, reflecting its multicultural and multilingual fabric. The narrow defeat of the 1995 referendum underscored both the strength of the sovereignty movement and the resilience of a united Canada. This chapter portrays Montreal as a city negotiating its identity through law and politics. Bill 101 and the referendums were not just legal or political events, they were emotional, cultural turning points. Montreal emerged more francophone, more assertive, but also more complex, a city where identity was both a battle and a bond. Montreal today is a city alive with echoes of its past and rhythms of its present. Cobblestone streets of old Montreal preserve the memory of Ville-Marie, while skyscrapers reflect its modern ambition. Murals on Plateau Montréal tell stories as vividly as Notre Dame Basilica's stained glass. The city is a canvas, painted layer upon layer, each era leaving its mark. It is a city of festivals, jazz just for laughs, Nuit Blanche, celebrating creativity and diversity. Its food scene reflects centuries of immigration, bagels and smoked meat alongside poutine and Haitian griot. Its neighborhoods pulse with identity, from Little Italy to Chinatown, Mile End to Hochelaga. Montreal's vibrancy lies in its plurality, its willingness to embrace contradictions. Yet, challenges remain. Economic shifts, housing pressures, and debates over language and culture continue. But Montreal has always been resilient. Its history is not one of linear triumph, but of survival, adaptation, and reinvention. From Hochelaga to Ville-Marie, from Conquest to Expo, from rebellion to referendums, Montreal has never stopped negotiating its identity and never stopped thriving. This closing chapter ties past to present, showing Montreal as more than a city. It is a living story shaped by rivers and rebellions, faith and festivals, languages and laws. A city resilient, rebellious, and endlessly alive. Montreal's untold past is not just history, it is the heartbeat of the present and the promise of what's still to come. Montreal's story is not finished, it is unfolding still. Every mural, every festival, every voice in French, English, or a dozen other tongues is part of its living heartbeat. It is a city that remembers Hochelaga, honors Ville-Marie, and carries the scars of conquest and rebellion. A city that dares to dream Expo, Olympics, festivals, no matter the cost. Montreal is resilience made stone, rebellion made song, and history made present. Its untold past is a mirror to its future. To walk its streets is to walk through centuries and to feel a city that will always defiantly be alive.